Margaret stood frozen in her childhood kitchen, watching her parents wipe tears of laughter from their eyes while her 5-year-old daughter pressed a tiny hand to her reddened cheek. The sound of their cruel chuckling echoed in her ears like a death knell to everything she thought she knew about family. In that moment, she realized that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you become the very ones you need protection from. Margaret had always believed in the power of family. At 52, she had built her life around the warm memories of Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings, and the comforting presence of her parents' farmhouse just 20 minutes from her own home. Her daughter Emma, now 5 years old, was the light of her life, a spirited little girl with wild curls and an infectious giggle that could brighten any room. After her divorce 3 years earlier, Margaret had leaned heavily on her family for support. Her parents, Robert and Helen, had been her anchor during those difficult months. They babysat Emma while Margaret worked her job at the local library, and their home became a second sanctuary for both mother and daughter. Her brother David, 45 and recently moved back home after his own marriage fell apart, seemed to enjoy having a niece to spoil. The Sunday visits had become sacred ritual. Margaret would pack Emma's favorite toys, and they'd spend the afternoon in the familiar embrace of the old house where she'd grown up. Her mother would fuss over Emma, teaching her to bake cookies and tend to the garden. Her father would read stories in his deep, patient voice while Emma curled up beside him on the worn leather couch. David's presence added another layer of warmth to these gatherings. He was good with Emma, patient with her endless questions and games. Margaret often thought how lucky Emma was to have such a loving uncle, especially since her own father had become increasingly distant since the divorce. The little girl needed positive male figures in her life, and David seemed to fill that role perfectly. But families, Margaret would soon learn, are like old houses, beautiful on the surface, but sometimes hiding rot beneath the floorboards. The cracks were so small at first that she convinced herself they were just shadows. How could she have known that the foundation of everything she trusted was about to crumble beneath her feet? The first sign came on a quiet Tuesday evening in March. Margaret was running late picking up Emma from her parents' house, caught up in a particularly challenging day at the library. When she finally arrived, she found Emma unusually quiet, sitting on the porch steps instead of playing in the yard as usual. "How was your day with Grandma and Grandpa?" Margaret asked, buckling Emma into her car seat. Emma's response was barely a whisper. "Uncle David got mad at me." Margaret's heart skipped. "What happened, sweetheart?" "I was being too loud when he was watching TV. He said I was giving him a headache." Emma's voice carried a tremor that made Margaret's chest tighten. "He used his scary voice, Mommy." When Margaret gently pressed for more details, Emma clammed up, the way children do when they sense adult tension. Margaret made a mental note to talk to David about his tone, but she pushed down the unease. Everyone had bad days, and David had been under stress with his job search. The second incident happened 2 weeks later. Margaret arrived to find Emma in the bathroom, carefully washing her hands with an intensity that seemed unusual for a 5-year-old. Her daughter's shirt was damp, and there were traces of what looked like chocolate on her collar. "Did you have a snack, baby?" Margaret asked. Emma's eyes darted toward the living room where David was sprawled on the couch, remote in hand. "Uncle David said I was messy," she whispered. "He said I had to clean it up all by myself, and if I got anything else dirty, I'd be in big trouble." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She'd raised Emma to be independent, but there was something in her daughter's tone, a fear that hadn't been there before. When she mentioned it to her mother, Helen had laughed it off. "David's just teaching her responsibility, dear. Children need structure." But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting in their perfect family dynamic. Emma's laughter seemed more subdued during their visits, and she stayed closer to Margaret's side instead of running freely through the house as she used to. The little girl who once chattered nonstop now seemed to measure her words carefully when Uncle David was around. Margaret told herself she was overreacting. Families had their rough patches. David was adjusting to living with his parents again, and maybe he just needed time to find his equilibrium. But deep in her heart, a mother's instinct was beginning to sound an alarm that she wasn't quite ready to hear. The assault happened on a sunny Sunday afternoon in early May. Margaret had stepped outside to help her mother hang laundry on the line, leaving Emma inside playing with her toy kitchen set, a gift from her grandparents that had become her favorite plaything. The sound of Emma's delighted chatter as she cooked imaginary meals had filled the house with joy, or so Margaret thought. She was laughing with her mother about Emma's latest pronunciation of spaghetti, when the sound reached them, a sharp crack followed by Emma's scream of shock and pain. Margaret's blood turned to ice. She dropped the wet sheet she was holding and ran toward the house, her heart hammering against her ribs. The scene that greeted her in the living room would be seared into her memory forever. Emma was on the floor, her small body crumpled against the coffee table, her hand pressed to her left cheek where angry red fingerprints were already beginning to form. David stood over her, his face twisted with rage, his right hand still raised from the blow he delivered to her 5-year-old daughter. She wouldn't stop making noise. David shouted, his voice carrying a venom that Margaret had never heard before. I'd been telling her to be quiet, but she just kept banging those stupid pots and pans. Margaret's world tilted. She rushed to Emma, gathering her sobbing daughter into her arms, feeling the heat radiating from the small, bruised cheek. Emma's body shook with the kind of crying that comes from shock and betrayal, the tears of a child who has just learned that the world can be a dangerous place, even in spaces that should be safe. You hit her, Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible over Emma's sobs. You hit my daughter. David's expression shifted from anger to something that looked almost like annoyance. I gave her a tap to get her attention. She wasn't listening. Margaret stared at him in disbelief. A tap. The mark on Emma's face was already darkening, and her little body was trembling with trauma. This wasn't discipline, this was violence against a child barely out of toddlerhood, but what happened next would haunt Margaret for months to come. Her parents, drawn by the commotion, appeared in the doorway. When they saw the scene, Emma crying in Margaret's arms, the obvious handprint on her cheek, David standing defensive and unapologetic, they didn't rush to comfort their granddaughter, they laughed. The sound of her parents' laughter cut through Margaret like a physical blow. Her mother's familiar giggle, usually so warm and comforting, now seemed grotesque as it mixed with her father's deep chuckle. They stood in the doorway of their own living room, watching their granddaughter sob with a bruised face, and they were laughing as if they'd just witnessed the punchline of a joke. Oh my goodness, her mother said, wiping tears from her eyes. The look on her face. David, you should have seen yourself, you looked like you were swatting a fly. Margaret's father joined in, his voice booming with the same hearty laughter that had once made Margaret feel safe as a child. Kids these days don't know when to quit, do they? Sometimes they need a little reminder about who's in charge. Margaret felt as if the ground had opened beneath her feet. These were the people who had raised her, who had taught her about kindness and protection. These were the grandparents who had sung Emma lullabies and pushed her on swings and promised to always keep her safe. Now they were standing there, treating her child's pain like entertainment. She's 5 years old, Margaret said, her voice shaking with disbelief. She's 5 years old, and you're laughing because she got hit? Her mother waved a dismissive hand. Oh, Margaret, don't be so dramatic. David barely touched her. Children are resilient, she'll forget all about it by tomorrow. But Emma wouldn't forget. Margaret could see it in her daughter's eyes, the confusion, the fear, the way she pressed herself deeper into her mother's embrace as if trying to disappear. The trust that had taken 5 years to build was crumbling in real time. David shrugged, his earlier anger replaced by a casual indifference that was somehow even more chilling. Maybe now she'll listen when an adult tells her to be quiet. Margaret looked around the room. The tea had once felt like home, seeing it now through different eyes. The family photos on the walls seemed to mock her with their smiling faces. The comfortable furniture where she'd spent countless happy hours now felt like stage props in a play she didn't recognize. We're leaving, Margaret said, standing with Emma still in her arms. Her mother's laughter finally stopped. Don't be ridiculous. You're overreacting. Emma's fine. But Emma wasn't fine. Margaret could feel her daughter's tears soaking through her shirt, could hear the hiccuping sobs that spoke of a child's broken trust. As she carried Emma toward the door, she heard her father's voice behind her, tinged with irritation. You're raising that child to be too sensitive, Margaret. The world isn't going to coddle her forever. Margaret didn't turn around. She couldn't bear to see their faces again, couldn't risk hearing more words that would shatter what little remained of her faith in the people who had given her life. She walked out of her childhood home carrying her wounded daughter, not knowing that it would be months before she'd find the strength to walk back through that door. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of Margaret's life. Emma had finally stopped crying, but the silence that replaced her sobs was somehow worse. Her daughter sat in her car seat, staring out the window with an expression far too mature for her 5 years. The red mark on her cheek had deepened to an angry purple, and Margaret had to grip the steering wheel tighter to keep her hands from shaking. At home, Margaret knelt in front of Emma, gently examining the bruise that had formed. Does it hurt, baby? Emma nodded, her voice small and uncertain. Why did Uncle David hit me, Mommy? I was just playing. Margaret's heart broke all over again. How do you explain to a child that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you can hurt you? How do you make sense of violence from someone who had been building trust for years? Some people don't know how to use their words when they're upset, Margaret said carefully. But hitting is never okay, Emma. Never. Are Grandma and Grandpa mad at me too? The question cut deeper than Margaret had expected. Emma had heard the laughter, had seen the lack of concern from the people who claimed to love her most. In her child's mind, she was trying to understand if she had done something wrong, if she deserved what happened to her. No, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong. Nothing at all. But even as Margaret spoke the words, she felt the weight of her own confusion. Her parents' reaction had been so unexpected, so completely outside the realm of the people she thought she knew. Had she been blind to something all these years? Had there been signs she'd missed? The next few days passed in a haze of sleepless nights and careful observations. Emma seemed smaller somehow, less vibrant. She played quietly, spoke in whispers, and flinched when doors closed too loudly. Margaret found herself watching her daughter Constantine. Why, looking for signs of healing while battling her own trauma, her phone rang constantly, her mother calling to check in, her father leaving voicemails about family dinners, and moving past this little incident. Margaret let every call go to voicemail. She wasn't ready to hear their voices, wasn't ready to face the possibility that they might minimize what had happened again. The worst part was the isolation. Margaret had always been able to talk to her parents about everything, her fears, her hopes, her struggles as a single mother. Now that lifeline was severed, and she felt completely alone. She considered calling her few close friends, but how do you explain that your family had revealed themselves to be strangers? How do you admit that the people you trusted most had failed you in the most fundamental way? At night, after Emma was finally asleep, Margaret would sit in her kitchen and replay the scene over and over. She analyzed every detail, searching for something she might have missed, some way to make it make sense. But the truth was becoming increasingly clear. Her family had shown her exactly who they were, and she had to decide what to do with that knowledge. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Margaret was at the grocery store 3 weeks after the incident, Emma clinging to her side as they navigated the aisles. Her daughter's bruise had faded to a yellowish shadow, but the emotional wounds were still raw. Emma barely spoke above a whisper in public now, and she startled at sudden movements or raised voices. They were in the cereal aisle when Margaret heard a familiar voice behind them. Margaret? Is that you? She turned to find Janet Morrison, her former neighbor from before the divorce. Janet was in her 60s, a retired teacher with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Margaret had always liked her, but they'd lost touch after the move. Janet, how wonderful to see you, Margaret said, forcing brightness into her voice that she didn't feel. Janet's expression shifted as she noticed Emma's withdrawn demeanor. With the instinct of someone who had spent decades working with children, she knelt down to Emma's level. "Hello there, sweetheart. I remember you when you were just learning to walk. You used to wave at me from your bedroom window." Emma managed a small smile but stayed pressed against Margaret's leg. Janet's experienced eyes didn't miss the way the child positioned herself, the hypervigilance that had replaced her former carefree spirit. "Would you like to help me find the best cereal?" Janet asked gently. "I can never decide between the ones with marshmallows and the ones with fruit." Emma looked up at Margaret for permission before taking a tentative step toward Janet. As her daughter became absorbed in the serious business of cereal selection, Janet moved closer to Margaret. "She's different," Janet said quietly. "Something's happened." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Someone had noticed. Someone saw what she saw, that Emma had been fundamentally changed by what had happened to her. "It's complicated," Margaret whispered. Janet nodded knowingly. "It usually is. But trauma in children, it has a particular look. I've seen it too many times." She paused, studying Margaret's face. "Are you getting help for her?" Margaret realized she hadn't even considered professional help. She'd been so focused on trying to process her own shock and betrayal that she hadn't thought about what Emma might need beyond her mother's protection. I don't know where to start," Margaret admitted. Janet reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook. She scribbled something quickly and tore out the page. "Dr. Sarah Chen. She's a child psychologist who specializes in trauma. She's wonderful with little ones, and she takes insurance." Janet pressed the paper into Margaret's hand. "Call her. Emma deserves to feel safe again." As they parted ways, Janet squeezed Margaret's shoulder. "And Margaret? You deserve to feel safe too. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who hurt us deepest. But that doesn't mean you have to carry this alone." That evening, after Emma was asleep, Margaret sat staring at the phone number Janet had given her. Making the call would mean admitting that what happened was serious enough to require professional help. It would mean acknowledging that her family had inflicted trauma on her child, but looking at Emma's sleeping face, still so much smaller and more fragile than it had been a month ago, Margaret knew she had to try. Her daughter deserved every chance to heal, even if it meant facing truths that Margaret wasn't ready to confront. Dr. Sarah Chen's office was nothing like Margaret had expected. Instead of sterile white walls and intimidating diplomas, the space was warm and inviting, filled with soft lighting, comfortable chairs, and a play area that looked more like a friend's living room than a medical facility. Emma had been hesitant at first, but Dr. Chen's gentle approach and genuine warmth had gradually coaxed her out of her shell. "Children communicate through play," Dr. Chen explained to Margaret during their third session. "Emma's been showing me a lot through her interactions with the dollhouse family." Margaret watched through the one-way window as Emma carefully arranged the small figures. The mother doll and child doll were always positioned far away from the adult male figures, and Emma had spent considerable time building walls and barriers around their play area. "She's processing what happened," Dr. Chen continued. "But she's also showing me something else. She doesn't trust the authority figures in her life to protect her anymore. That includes you, Margaret." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. "But I got her away from there. I protected her." "You did," Dr. Chen agreed. "But from Emma's perspective, you brought her into a situation where she was hurt, and the adults who were supposed to keep her safe either harmed her or laughed at her pain. Young children don't understand complex family dynamics, they only know that they weren't safe, and the adults didn't stop it." Margaret felt the weight of her own trauma settling over her like a heavy blanket. She'd been so focused on protecting Emma that she hadn't fully processed her own shock and betrayal. But Dr. Chen was right, Emma needed to see that her mother was strong enough to protect them both. "What do I do?" Margaret asked. "You start by taking care of yourself," Dr. Chen said gently. Emma needs to see that you can handle this situation, that you're not going to let it happen again. But first, you need to believe that yourself. Over the following weeks, Margaret began her own journey of healing. She started seeing a therapist, Dr. Michael Rodriguez, who specialized in family trauma and betrayal. The sessions were difficult, facing the reality that her parents had chosen to minimize and mock her daughter's pain rather than protect her. They showed you who they are, Dr. Rodriguez said during one particularly difficult session. The question is, what are you going to do with that information? Margaret had been avoiding that question for weeks. Her parents continued to call, leaving increasingly frustrated messages about her overreaction and her need to get over this. They acted as if she was the one being unreasonable, as if she was creating drama where none existed, but something was changing inside Margaret. The fog of shock and disbelief was lifting, replaced by a clarity that felt both frightening and empowering. She was seeing her family's behavior for what it truly was, not love, not protection, but a willingness to sacrifice a child's well-being for their own comfort. Emma was slowly beginning to smile again, but she still flinched at sudden noises and avoided male strangers. Dr. Chen had assured Margaret that children were resilient, but healing took time. Emma needed to see that her mother was willing to fight for her, to prioritize her safety over family harmony. I want to file a police report, Margaret said suddenly during one of her sessions with Dr. Rodriguez. He nodded thoughtfully. What's driving that decision? Emma needs to see that what happened to her was wrong. She needs to see that I'll stand up for her, even when it's hard. Margaret's voice grew stronger. And David needs to understand that hitting a child has consequences. For the first time in Monts, Margaret felt like she was taking back control. She was no longer the shocked, betrayed daughter standing frozen in her parents' kitchen. She was a mother who was ready to fight for her child's safety and dignity. Filing the police report was one of the hardest things Margaret had ever done. She sat in the sterile waiting room of the police station, Emma's small hand in hers, both of them nervous but determined. Detective Lisa Hayes, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, had been assigned to their case. I know this is difficult, Detective Hayes said as she led them to a child-friendly interview room. But you're doing the right thing. Children need to know that adults will protect them, even when it's uncomfortable. Emma's interview was conducted with Margaret present, using dolls and drawings to help the little girl communicate what had happened. Detective Hayes was patient and skilled, never pushing too hard but allowing Emma to tell her story in her own way. Uncle David hit me here, Emma said, pointing to her cheek on the doll. It hurt a lot, and I was scared. What did the other adults do when this happened? Detective Hayes asked gently. Emma's voice became very small. Grandma and Grandpa laughed. They thought it was funny. Margaret watched her daughter relive the trauma, her heart breaking anew. But she also saw something else, Emma sitting a little straighter, speaking a little more clearly. For the first time since the incident, someone in authority was taking her seriously, treating her words as important. The investigation process was thorough but emotionally exhausting. Detective Hayes interviewed Margaret extensively, documenting not just the physical assault but the emotional trauma that had followed. She also spoke with Dr. Chen, who provided professional documentation of Emma's ongoing treatment for trauma. The physical evidence is limited since you didn't report it immediately, Detective Hayes explained. But we have Emma's testimony, your testimony, and the professional documentation of her trauma. That's enough to move forward. Margaret's parents were furious when they learned about the police report. Her mother called screaming about betrayal and destroying the family. Her father left voicemails about making mountains out of molehills and getting the police involved in family business. But the most revealing call came from David himself. His voice was cold and calculating, nothing like the brother she thought she knew. You've made a big mistake, Margaret, he said. This is going to tear our family apart over nothing. Emma's fine, kids are tougher than you think. You're just trying to get attention. Margaret saved the voicemail. Dr. Rodriguez had warned her that family members often revealed their true nature when their actions had consequences. David's complete lack of remorse, his minimization of Emma's pain, his attempt to manipulate Margaret into backing down, it all confirmed what she had begun to understand about who he really was. The legal process moved slowly, but Margaret found strength in taking action. Emma was improving in therapy, and she seemed to gain confidence from knowing that her mother was fighting for her. The little girl who had been so withdrawn and fearful was beginning to show flashes of her old spirit. "Mommy," Emma said one evening as Margaret tucked her into bed, "are you going to make sure Uncle David doesn't hurt other kids?" Margaret's heart swelled with pride at her daughter's concern for others, even after her own trauma. "I'm going to try, sweetheart. That's why we talked to the police officer, to make sure Uncle David learns that hitting children is never okay." Emma nodded seriously. "Good. Because hitting isn't love." Out of the mouths of babes, Margaret thought. Her 5-year-old daughter had learned something that her adult family members seemed unable to grasp: violence was never an expression of love, and those who to love you should be the first to protect you, not the first to harm you. The case against David resulted in a plea agreement 6 months after Margaret first filed the report. He was charged with assault on a minor and required to complete anger management classes, perform community service, and stay away from Margaret and Emma. It wasn't the jail time Margaret had hoped for, but it was official acknowledgement that what he had done was wrong. More importantly, the legal process had created a paper trail. If David ever harmed another child, there would be a record of his previous behavior. Detective Hayes assured Margaret that this documentation could be crucial in protecting other children in the future. "You did something incredibly brave," Detective Hayes told Margaret on the day the case was resolved. "Many parents don't report family violence because they're afraid of the consequences. But you put your daughter's safety first, and that takes real courage." Margaret's parents never forgave her for involving strangers in family business. They sent a carefully worded letter through their attorney, stating that Margaret and Emma were no longer welcome in their home. The letter was cold and formal, nothing like the warm, loving grandparents Margaret had believed them to be, but the letter also revealed something telling. They blamed Margaret for destroying the family and turning a minor incident into a legal matter. Even faced with official consequences, they couldn't acknowledge the seriousness of what David had done to Emma. "They're protecting him instead of protecting Emma," Margaret told Dr. Rodriguez during one of their sessions. "They're choosing him over their own granddaughter. How does that make you feel?" Dr. Rodriguez asked. Margaret thought for a long moment. Sad. Angry. But also, relieved. "I don't have to pretend anymore that they're people they're not. I don't have to worry about Emma being hurt by them again." The truth was, Margaret felt lighter than she had in months. The constant anxiety about family gatherings, the walking on eggshells, the worry about Emma's safety, it was all gone. She and Emma were building a new life, one based on actual safety rather than the illusion of family harmony. Emma continued to thrive in therapy. Dr. Chen reported that the little girl's trauma symptoms were significantly improved, and she was beginning to show trust in other adults again. Most importantly, Emma had learned that her voice mattered, that adults would listen to her and take action to protect her. "She's going to be okay," Dr. Chen told Margaret. "Children who have adults who believe them and fight for them, they recover from trauma. Emma knows you chose her safety over family pressure. That's going to shape her understanding of what real love looks like for the rest of her life." Margaret started a support group for parents dealing with family violence. She met other mothers who had faced similar situations, family members who had hurt their children and relatives who had minimized or denied the abuse. Together, they created a network of support and understanding. "We're not just protecting our children," Margaret told the group during one of their meetings. "We're teaching them that they deserve to be safe, that their pain matters, that someone will always fight for them. That's the most important lesson we can give them." As Margaret looked around the room at the other brave mothers, she realized that her family's betrayal had led her to something unexpected, a chosen family of people who understood what it meant to put children's safety first. even when it cost them everything. 2 years after that devastating Sunday afternoon, Margaret stood in her kitchen making breakfast for Emma, now 7 years old. The house was filled with the sound of her daughter's laughter as she played with Luna, the golden retriever puppy they'd adopted 6 months earlier. Emma's joy was genuine now, not the careful, measured happiness of a child afraid to make too much noise. "Mommy, can Sarah come to my birthday party?" Emma asked, referring to her new best friend from school. "Of course, baby. Anyone else you'd like to invite?" Emma rattled off a list of classmates and friends, her voice bright with excitement. Margaret smiled, remembering how different things had been just 2 years ago. The birthday party they'd planned for Emma's 6th birthday had been a small, quiet affair. Emma had been too anxious around groups of people, too worried about making noise or being too much. Dr. Chen had officially discharged Emma from therapy 6 months earlier, declaring her fully recovered from the trauma. Emma still had some lingering sensitivity to sudden loud noises, but she was confident, social, and secure in her mother's love and protection. Margaret had also completed her own therapy, though she still attended the support group she'd started. Leading the group had become a passion, helping other parents navigate the complex world of family violence and institutional betrayal. She'd even started speaking at conferences about the importance of believing children and taking action, even when it meant challenging family systems. "We can't protect our children from all harm," Margaret would tell audiences. "But we can show them that their safety matters more than anyone's comfort. We can teach them that love means protection, not performance." The legal consequences for David had been minimal, but the social consequences had been significant. Word had spread through THEIR's small community about what had happened. David had difficulty finding work and eventually moved to another state. Margaret's parents had become increasingly isolated, as other family members and friends began to distance themselves from people who would laugh at a child's pain. Margaret felt no satisfaction in their social exile, only sadness for the people they could have been if they'd chosen differently. But she also felt profound gratitude for the clarity their betrayal had provided. Emma would never again be exposed to people who valued family reputation over child safety. "Mommy," Emma said, interrupting Margaret's thoughts, "I want to tell you something." Margaret knelt down to her daughter's level, giving her full attention. "What is it, sweetheart?" "I'm glad you believed me," Emma said seriously. "And I'm glad you made Uncle David have consequences. Ms. Rodriguez at school says that when someone hurts you, it's important that someone helps you and makes sure it doesn't happen again." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Emma's teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, was a young woman who had become a mentor and friend. She was part of the chosen family Margaret had built, people who understood that children's safety was paramount. "I will always believe you," Margaret promised. "And I will always fight for you." Emma hugged her tight, and Margaret marveled at the strength in her daughter's small arms. Emma had learned that she could survive betrayal and come out stronger. She had learned that her voice mattered, that adults would listen to her, that someone would always choose her safety over convenience. As Margaret held her daughter, she thought about the woman she'd been 2 years ago, the one who had trusted blindly, who had prioritized family harmony over her child's well-being. That woman had been shattered by betrayal, but from her broken pieces, a stronger woman had emerged. A woman who understood that real love sometimes meant making hard choices, that protecting children sometimes meant standing alone, and that the most important family you could build was one based on safety, respect, and genuine care. The sun streamed through the kitchen windows, illuminating the life Margaret and Emma had built together. It was smaller than the extended family they'd lost, but it was real. It was safe. It was home. Moral of the story: sometimes the people we trust most will fail us in the most fundamental ways, but our response to that betrayal defines not just our own healing, but the safety and future of those we love. Real love means protecting the vulnerable, even when it costs us everything we thought we knew about family. When we choose courage over comfort, truth over tradition, and safety over silence, we teach our children that they matter, and that lesson becomes the foundation for every relationship they'll ever have.